The morning my grandson turned the key in the lock and left his grandmother and me standing in the dark of my own gun room. I didn't bang on the door. I didn't holler. I just stood there on the cold concrete and listened to his boots cross the den above us. Listened to him laugh at something my granddaughter-in-law said, and I thought to myself, that boy has no earthly idea what he's just done. My wife found my hand in the black. Her fingers were ice. They've been cold like that since the stroke started 2 winters ago. Little ones the doctors called TIAs, like calling a brush fire a little smoke. She squeezed my hand the way she does when she's scared and doesn't want to say it out loud, and I leaned over and put my mouth close to her ear and said, "Ruth, don't say a word. They think it's over. It isn't even close." She went still. After 46 years, she knows the difference between me being stubborn and me being sure, and that morning I was sure. She let her shoulders drop and breathed out slow and put her weight against me and trusted me. And I want to tell you, that trust is about the only thing I've ever earned in this life that I'm truly proud of. Let me back up and tell you about the house, because you can't understand any of this without the house. I built it. Not contracted it out, not bought it half-finished and slapped my name on it. I built it with these hands, starting in the fall of 1981, on 80 acres of red dirt and oak scrub in the hill country north of Kerrville, Texas. I just left the Navy after 20 years, a chief petty officer with a pension and a lump sum and a back that already ached when it rained. I was 41. Ruth was 38, and we'd given up on babies years before. So when she told me she was pregnant with our boy David that same autumn, I decided right then that child was going to grow up under a roof his daddy raised with his own arms. Took me almost 2 years. I poured the slab in sections on the weekends. I framed it after my shifts driving a propane truck because a pension in 1981 didn't stretch the way folks think it did. And a man with a baby coming finds work wherever he can. Ruth painted the inside while I was still nailing the outside. We moved in the week before David was born, in a house that smelled like fresh-cut pine and joint compound, and I have never since lived anywhere that felt as much like mine. That house had 3 bedrooms, a long screened porch where the evening breeze came up off the draw, a kitchen. Ruth wanted big enough to feed a church social, and down off the mudroom, a room I dug into the limestone and finished out with my own blockwork. I built it for storage and for shelter. A place to ride out the tornadoes that come tearing across the Texas hills every spring. Over the years, it became my gun room. I'm a hunter, always have been, and I keep things proper. A good steel safe, a heavy door, a deadbolt I put on myself so a curious grandchild couldn't wander in. That deadbolt. I never once, in 40 years, imagined it would be turned on me. David grew up good, I'll say that. It was his son, my grandson Tyler, where the trouble took root. We raised Tyler more than his folks did, truth be told. David and his wife split ugly when the boy was 9, and Ruth and I had him summers and most weekends, taught him to fish the Guadalupe and field dress a deer and shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. He was a sweet kid. I want that on the record because it makes the rest of it hurt worse. There's a photo on our mantle of Tyler at 7, gap-toothed, holding up a bluegill barely bigger than the hook, grinning like he'd landed a marlin. That picture is still there. I'm not taking it down. Somewhere around 22, 23, Tyler changed. He'd gotten into something he called real estate investing, which as far as I could ever tell meant borrowing money to flip houses and borrowing more to cover the first loans. He married a girl named Brittany who came from money, or acted like she did, and the two of them had the kind of life that looks expensive and feels hollow. Lease payments on 2 German cars, a house in a gated stretch outside San Antonio with a mortgage that would choke a horse, vacations they posted pictures of, and underneath all of it I came to learn later, a mountain of debt that was about to bury them both. Our place, by then, sat on land that had quietly turned valuable. When I bought those 80 acres, hill country dirt went for next to nothing. By 2023, the county had it appraised north of $900,000, and the developers calling about it weren't shy. I knew what it was worth. I also saw the way Tyler's eyes started moving over it whenever he came out. The way a man looks at another man's truck when he's already decided he deserves it more. It started, the way these things always do, with a phone call that sounded like love. Tyler called me on a Sunday night in late September and said he'd been doing some reading about estate planning, that he was worried about us, that he'd hate to see the government take half of everything we'd worked for when we passed. He used the words protecting the family. He said he had a guy, a financial planner, who could help us move the property into Tyler's name now while we were healthy and avoid a fortune in taxes down the road. He said Ruth's health made it real important we get ahead of this. I told him I had a lawyer already. Same fellow handled my affairs for 30 years, an old country attorney named Sam Castile down in Kerrville, who'd drawn up my will and my trust and knew exactly what I wanted done with everything I owned. Tyler got quiet, then said Sam was old-fashioned, that this was specialized work and I needed somebody who understood modern tax strategy. I told him I'd think on it. Then I hung up, sat with it about a minute and called Sam. Sam listened to the whole thing without saying much. Then he said, real slow, Walt, I want you to promise me something. You don't sign one single piece of paper that boy or his planner puts in front of you. Not a deed, not a power of attorney, not a thing. You bring it to me first, every time. You hear? I told him I heard him fine. Then I told Ruth. She sat at the kitchen table I'd built out of mesquite and she cried. Quiet, the way she does, no fuss to it. And then she wiped her face with the dish towel and said, I've known a while, Walt. A mama knows when her boy's gone wrong. She didn't mean David, she meant Tyler. And it about broke me, because she was right and because there's no pain quite like watching someone you raised turn into someone you have to protect yourself from. The pressure came on slow over that fall and winter, the way water works on stone. Tyler started coming around more, bringing Brittany, bringing barbecue and a case of Ruth's favorite Dr. Pepper in the little glass bottles. He'd sit on the porch and talk about how hard it must be to keep 80 acres up at our age. He'd mention, casual as you please, what the upkeep ran, the property taxes, the cost of the diesel for the tractor. He had a way of making the home I'd built sound like a weight strapped to my back. Brittany worked on Ruth. Told her how worried she was. Told her she just wanted us comfortable. Wanted us not to have to lift a finger in our old age. She'd take Ruth's hand across the table and look at her with eyes so sincere, I wondered if she practiced them in the rearview mirror. Ruth's health was failing through all of this. After the little strokes, her balance went bad, and the cold got into her bones in a way it never had, and she couldn't always find the right word, which frustrated her more than the rest of it put together. I'd taken over the cooking, the driving. The doctor runs 40 minutes into town. I think Tyler watched all that and decided his grandmother getting weaker was his window. I think that's a thing I'll never forgive him for. Not the lock, not the lies, but that he looked at Ruth fading and saw an opportunity. It came to a head on a Saturday in the middle of January. Coldest day we'd had in years. A hard blue norther that dropped us down into the low 20s with a wind that cut clean through canvas. Tyler and Brittany drove up in the morning with a leather folder and faces full of concern they'd clearly rehearsed. They sat down at the mesquite table and Tyler slid the papers across to me and started in. It was a deed transfer, full conveyance of the property and the house to Tyler, dressed up with what he called a life estate, language that supposedly let Ruth and me live there till we died. He explained it the way he explained everything, smooth, throwing in just enough lawyer words to make a man feel dumb for asking questions. I read every page. Took my time too on purpose, watching his knee start to bounce. When I set it down, I looked across at my grandson and I said, Tyler, a life estate, the holder of that deed can sometimes break it. Force a sale. You know that, son. He looked at Brittany. Brittany looked at the table. And I said, I'm not signing this. That's when the masks came off. Not all at once. They slid off slow, like ice melting off a windshield. And what was underneath wasn't pretty. Tyler said I was being a selfish old fool, that I was going to cost the family hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pure stubbornness. Brittany said with Ruth's condition it was downright reckless of me not to plan, said it like she was the one who'd be up at night with her. I sat there and let them talk, and then I said, calm as I could, that I thought everybody ought to go home and pray on it. What happened next, I did not see coming, and I've gone back over it 100 times since trying to find the moment I should have. I always land in the same spot. I should have seen it when Tyler stood up and his eyes went to the door of the gun room. He knew that room. He'd been in it with me a dozen times, picking out a rifle for a hunt, the way a boy does when his grandpa trusts him. He knew the heavy door. He knew the deadbolt on the outside. What he didn't know, what nobody on this earth knew except me, was what I'd built into the far wall of that room back in 1983. I'd laid it in myself. The year after we moved in, during a stretch when I was reading everything I could get on protecting what little I had, because a man who grows up with nothing never quite believes the floor won't drop out again. I was a Navy man. I think in damage control, in redundancy, in what you do when the first plant floods. So behind a section of limestone block at the back of that room, I built a cavity, maybe 2 foot wide and a foot deep, sealed off with a cut stone that sat flush and was held by a single latch you had to know to find. Inside, a fireproof box. I'd updated what was in it over the years. By that January, the box held a certified copy of my will and my trust papers, a recorded copy of the deed, showing the whole property locked inside an irrevocable trust. One I'd quietly had Sam restructure about a year and a half before, the minute I'd started to understand what Tyler was becoming. A plain letter from Sam laying out, in words a child could follow, that the land could not be sold, transferred, or borrowed against by anyone without busting the trust wide open and bringing the law down on whoever tried. And 6 months before all this, I'd put one more thing in that box, a cheap prepaid phone, charged full, sealed in a freezer bag. I never told Ruth about any of it. Not to keep secrets, but because I wanted, if the day ever came, to put something real in her hands instead of a worry. A box. A phone already ringing. Not a plan I'd scared her with for years over nothing. After I refused them, Brittany went off to the bathroom and Tyler got on his phone out in the hall, talking low and fast. Ruth and I sat at the table and finished our coffee and didn't say much, because by then we'd both gone quiet inside in the way you do when you can feel a thing coming and can't stop it. When Brittany came back, her face had changed. Set hard. She put on a soft voice anyhow and asked, wouldn't Ruth and I like to come look at the new safe Tyler had bought me for Christmas? Said he'd had it installed down in the gun room as a surprise, a peace offering after all the hard words. Ruth said yes before I could open my mouth. She was froze through and she wanted the fighting to stop. And Ruth has always believed, even now, even after everything, that people can rise above their meanest selves. It is the best thing about her, and the thing I've spent 46 years quietly afraid of. We went down, all 4 of us, into the cold of the gun room. There was no new safe, of course. I was halfway across the floor, turning to ask Tyler what foolishness this was, when I heard the door swing shut behind us. Then the deadbolt slid home from the outside, that heavy iron sound I'd heard 10,000 times and never once feared until that second. Tyler's voice came through the door, muffled but plenty clear. It's done, Grandpa. Brittany's already got the deed filed, and we've got a notary coming Monday to clean up the rest. You can sign and come up warm, or you can sit down there and think about it. Up to you. I heard Brittany say something I couldn't catch. Then their footsteps going up, and the den door closing, and the heater up there shutting off, because the boy had the nerve to kill the power to the whole back of the house from the breaker, so we'd feel the cold. Ruth grabbed my arm in the dark, and her grip was something fierce, the grip of a woman scared half to death and bound not to let it show. She said, Walt, it's freezing, and I left my pills upstairs. And I said, I know, sweetheart. Give me 3 minutes. I crossed that black room like it was lit up noon because I knew every foot of it. I'd laid the block. I knew how many steps to the back wall, knew right where the stone sat, knew the exact little push it took to trip the latch. I tested it twice that past year, once with the lights off, just to be certain these old hands still remembered. It popped on the second try. I reached in and got the box, and under it, the phone. I clicked on the phone's flashlight first, and Ruth made a sound I'd never heard out of her in 46 years, somewhere between a sob and a laugh. I held the light up and showed her the box, and I opened it and laid Sam's letter out across the lid, and I watched my wife read it there in that little cold blue light. When she finished, she looked up at me and her eyes were shining. I said, "They can't take it, Ruth. The trust makes that deed worth nothing. But I've got 2 calls to make first." The first was to Sam. He picked up on the second ring because I'd called him Friday night. The second, Tyler went quiet in my hallway and told him tomorrow might be the day, and asked him to keep his phone where he could hear it. He told me he'd already drawn up the emergency order, told me that notary on Monday was going to be met with a cease and desist instead of a signature. Then he told me to hang up and call 911. The second call was to the sheriff's dispatch. I told the woman on the line, steady as I could hold my voice, that my wife and I had been locked in our own storeroom by our grandson and his wife, who were trying to steal our property out from under us with a forged deed, that my wife had a heart and stroke condition and was without her medication, and that I needed a deputy and an ambulance both, fast. She asked was I safe where I was. I looked at Ruth sitting on an ammo crate with that box in her lap, reading Sam's letter a second time like a woman handed back something she'd already grieved losing. I said, "We're safe enough, but please hurry. It's awful cold down here." The deputy got there in 19 minutes. I know, because I watched the seconds tick by on that phone screen, counting them, not out of fear, but out of an old Navy habit of measuring everything that matters. We heard the knock at the front, heard Tyler's voice, surprised, then too smooth, heard a deputy ask to step inside. A stretch of quiet, then boots across the den floor and the deadbolt thrown back and light pouring down the gunroom stairs and a young deputy looking down at us, his face going from polite to something a good deal harder as he took in Ruth shivering on that crate with the box in her arms. He said, "Sir, are you Walter Buchanan?" I told him I was. He said, "Mr. Buchanan, can you and your wife come on up? The paramedics are right out front." I won't pretend the hours after that were easy, because they were not. Ruth went to the hospital. The cold and the fright had spiked her blood pressure, and they kept her 2 nights for watching. But the doctor took my hand and told me she'd come through fine. I stayed and gave my statement to 2 deputies and then to an investigator who showed up near 9 that night with a yellow pad and a tired, decent face. Now here's the part folks always want to know. The part where I tell you my grandson got off light because he was family. He didn't. They arrested Tyler that same night for unlawful restraint and for the attempted fraud. And Brittany, who I think believed all along that being the daughter-in-law would keep her clean, she got arrested right alongside him. Because in the state of Texas, when 2 people lock an old man and a sick woman in a cold room to force a signature, they are both of them guilty of the same crime. And the investigator made sure I understood that wasn't going to slide. She was charged as a full party to the unlawful restraint. The forged deed she'd filed at the courthouse turned out to be its own felony, and that one landed squarely on her. They both stood before a judge. Tyler took a plea that put him on probation with felony time hanging over his head and a record that follows him now into every loan application he'll ever fill out. Brittany's fraud case is still grinding through the court as I tell you this, but Sam says the filing was so clumsy she'll be lucky to stay out of a cell. The county victim's advocate, a sharp young woman who'd seen too much of this, told me most families never press it. I told her my wife was nearly killed over a piece of paper, and family or not, the law was going to mean something in my house. The trust held exactly the way Sam built it to hold. The forged deed was voided inside a week. The 80 acres are still ours, every red dirt foot of it. I sat in my kitchen that first night after everyone had cleared out, in the house I raised myself, with a cup of coffee gone stone cold, and I looked at that mesquite table, and what I felt wasn't anything like triumph. It was more the way it feels when you load a beam you built and it doesn't so much as creak. Just the quiet of a thing holding the weight it was made to hold. I'll be honest about the grief, because it's real and I won't lie to you about it. Tyler is my grandson. I taught that boy to tie his shoes and run a trot line. That gap-tooth picture is still on my mantle, and it's staying. Whatever he turned into, whatever Brittany helped him become, he was also that 7-year-old with the bluegill, and I have to hold both of those at once. And some days the holding is heavy. Ruth forgives easier than I do. She wrote Tyler a letter about a month after, and I didn't ask to read it and she didn't offer. I know he didn't write back. I know that's a wound her doctors can't find on any scan. But I'll tell you what I do know. Ruth came home from that hospital on a Wednesday, and I had a fire going and her chicken and dumplings on the stove. And the late sun was coming through the porch windows the way it does in winter, low and gold across the floor she painted herself in 1982. She stopped right there in the doorway. She looked around at the house, at the land white with frost out the glass, all of it still hers. She said, "You knew this was coming." I said, "I prayed I was wrong." She was quiet a long while. Then she said, "You built this whole house, and inside it, you built us a way out." I didn't have a thing to say to that. I just brought her the bowl and sat down beside her in the gold light. We've got a new arrangement now. Every paper, every copy, every contingency, Ruth knows where all of it lives. We laid it all out on the mesquite table one Sunday in March. The deed and the trust and the new will. The one that now leaves Tyler and Brittany exactly nothing and gives a good piece of what we have to a hill country outfit that helps old folks fight off the very thing that was done to us. Sam said in 30 years he never had a client answer getting robbed by funding a charity. I told him that was probably because most of his clients hadn't spent their lives building things meant to outlast the storm. The house is still standing. That's the truest sentence I know. I walk it most mornings before Ruth wakes, out through the porch, down to the storeroom, back up through the kitchen, out onto the dirt to look at the acres nobody managed to take. It's habit more than anything. The habit of a man who trusts nothing all the way and has to put his own hand on a wall to know it'll hold. It always does. I go back in and start the coffee and listen to the old house settle and tick in the cold. The small sounds a place makes when it's lived in and looked after. I think about my grandson's hand in mine when he was small. I think about Ruth's cold fingers gripping my arm in the dark. I think about what it takes to build a thing that holds. A locked door is insecurity. I learned that on a slab I poured myself. Security is everything you put in place before the door ever gets locked. The thinking ahead, the quiet getting ready, the refusing to believe a man can't be robbed by his own blood. Security is a charged phone sealed in a wall that only you know about, waiting all those years, because you loved your wife enough to plan 3 steps past the worst day of your life. They thought they could take this place. They forgot who laid the stone. People ask me sometimes if I regret pressing charges on my own grandson. I tell them the truth, which is that the regret and the rightness live in the same room and never have learned to leave each other alone. Tyler didn't end up cuffed in my driveway because the law is cruel. He ended up there because of a chain of choices he made, each one a little easier than the last, until locking his own grandmother in a freezing room felt to him like a reasonable business move. That's how it works. A man doesn't wake up one morning a thief. He talks himself into it one small lie at a time, and one day the deadbolt is in his hand and he can't even remember when he stopped seeing us as people. I've had a lot of mornings on that porch to think about why it went the way it did, and I keep coming back to 3 things a man has got to build in himself, same as he builds a house. The first is knowing right from wrong and refusing to trade it for comfort. Ruth had it. Even cold and scared in that dark, she'd have forgiven the boy on the spot, and I love her for it. But forgiveness and accountability aren't enemies. I drew a line and I held it, not out of spite, but because letting cruelty go unanswered just teaches the cruel that it works. If you take one thing from what happened to us, let it be that you can love somebody and still refuse to let them harm you. The second is the willingness to think hard and think ahead, even when everybody around you says you're being a worried old fool. I built that wall in 1983 not because I expected my own blood to turn on me, but because I learned young that hoping for the best is not a plan. Tyler had charm and Brittany had nerve, but neither of them ever sat still long enough to think 3 steps down the road. I did. That's the whole difference between the one who gets robbed and the one who doesn't. Use your head before the trouble comes, because in the cold and the dark, there's no time left to start figuring. The third is plain backbone. There was a moment at that mesquite table when signing would have been so much easier. Smile, sign, make the yelling stop. Most folks fold right there, and the Tylers of the world are counting on it. I didn't, because a thing worth a lifetime of work is worth one hard afternoon of standing your ground. Grit isn't loud. Mostly it's just one stubborn old man saying no and meaning it. The house is still standing, and so are we. That's not luck. That's a clear conscience, a careful mind, and the spine that wouldn't bend, all 3 carrying the load together. Build those into yourself while the weather's still good. Don't wait for somebody to slide the boat. By then, it's too late to start.